Welcome back to my YouTube channel today. And here is the content of today's video. Trump's previous approach to China was designed to be blunt. Tariffs, export controls, and strategic pressure were tools intended to shock a complacent system and force it to acknowledge its imbalances. In many ways, that goal was achieved. Supply chains were scrutinized, strategic dependencies exposed, and the costs of excessive economic dependence on China entered the political landscape in Washington. But these crude tools, effective at breaking inertia, are less suited to sustaining long-term stability. What has changed is not Trump's view of China's ambitions, but his assessment of American leverage. The relentless escalation has shown diminishing effectiveness. Economic decoupling has proven far more difficult than the slogans suggested. Financial markets, industrial networks, and the consumer economy all resist complete separation. Meanwhile, global instability from energy shocks to regional wars has reminded policymakers that excessive strategic expansion can undermine the very power they seek to project. This realization underpinned the shift. Trump's evolving security strategy recognizes that pressure alone cannot rearrange the world's second-largest economy. Power must go hand in hand with negotiation. Deterrence must coexist with deal. Within this framework, security is not an end in itself, but a means, a lever designed to open up space for negotiation, not to eliminate it. More importantly, this shift reflects a deeper strategic maturity. Trump's worldview is transactional, not ideological. He is less concerned with transforming China than with reshaping the terms of cooperation. The goal is not harmony, but advantage. It's not about trust, but about predictability. From this perspective, stability is preferred over chaos, not because China is docile, but because chaos weakens American power. This policy shift also signals an awareness of a changing global environment. The United States is no longer operating in a unipolar world. China's economic power, technological capabilities, and global influence limit the effectiveness of unilateral pressure. Escalation without a strategy risks accelerating the very multipolarity that Washington is trying to manage. In this context, Trump's shift is pragmatic. It reflects the belief that American strategic interests will be better served by managing competition rather than fanning the flames indefinitely. The security stance remains firm, deterrence remains central, but confrontation is no longer seen as the only path forward. The crucial insight is this: competition doesn't require constant crises. It requires limits. Trump's reshaping of policy toward China represents an attempt to redraw those limits, assertive enough to command respect, flexible enough to maintain economic cooperation, and cautious enough to avoid making irreversible decisions. Whether this balance can be maintained remains uncertain, but the shift itself marks a realization that power, when used without restraint, often undermines the very order it seeks to protect. Trump's evolving security strategy toward China rests on a paradox that is often misunderstood: the use of forceful posture not to provoke confrontation, but to structure negotiation. In this worldview, military strength, alliance signaling, and strategic deterrence are not ends in themselves. They are instruments designed to shape the bargaining environment before economic talks even begin. This approach reflects Trump's transactional instincts. He does not separate security from economics. He fuses them. Where traditional diplomacy seeks confidence building first and concessions later, Trump reverses the sequence. Pressure comes before dialogue. Leverage precedes compromise. Trump's evolving security strategy toward China rests on a paradox that is often misunderstood: the use of forceful posture not to provoke confrontation, but to structure negotiation. In this worldview, military strength, alliance signaling, and strategic deterrence are not ends in themselves. They are instruments designed to shape the bargaining environment before economic talks even begin. This approach reflects Trump's transactional instincts. He does not separate security from economics. He fuses them. Where traditional diplomacy seeks confidence building first and concessions later, Trump reverses the sequence. Pressure comes before dialogue. Leverage precedes compromise. On the contrary, Trump's strategy assumes that credible deterrence reduces the likelihood of conflict by eliminating ambiguity about American resolve. War is bad for deals. Instability disrupts markets. Trump, above all, measures success in outcomes, not ideological victories. And China, for its part, understands this language. Beijing's strategic culture is deeply attuned to balance of power signaling. It recognizes when pressure is meant to coerce and when it is meant to define negotiating boundaries. Trump's security posture, therefore, functions less as a threat and more as a framing device. This is the terrain on which engagement will occur. The economic implications are significant. Once security red lines are clarified, space opens for selective cooperation on trade stabilization, supply chain resilience, and investment frameworks that reduce mutual exposure without severing ties. Trump's pivot suggests an acceptance of partial decoupling rather than total separation, protect what is critical, negotiate what is productive, and avoid systemic rupture. Yet this strategy carries risks. Excessive pressure can harden positions rather than soften them. Allies may interpret transactional security as unpredictability. China may respond by accelerating self-reliance rather than compromise. The margin for error is narrow. Still, the core insight remains compelling. In a world of deep interdependence and rising rivalry, economic diplomacy cannot be detached from security realities. Trump's recalibration acknowledges this fusion. It accepts that cooperation will not be built on goodwill alone, but on mutual recognition of limits. Security, in this framework, is not the language of war. It is the grammar of negotiation. Whether this grammar can produce sustainable agreements with China remains uncertain, but it reflects a strategic bet that leverage, when used with restraint, can open doors that confrontation alone keeps closed. Behind the rhetoric of decoupling and confrontation lies a quieter, more stubborn reality. The United States and China remain deeply intertwined in ways that no political slogan can easily undo. Trump's strategic pivot implicitly acknowledges this fact. However fierce the rivalry, the economic relationship between the two powers is not a switch to be turned off, but a structure built over decades, dense, resilient, and costly to dismantle. The past several years have exposed the limits of economic separation. Tariffs reshuffled trade flows but did not end dependence. Supply chains bent, adapted, and rerouted, often at higher cost rather than disappearing. American consumers absorbed price increases. Global markets absorbed uncertainty. What emerged was not clean decoupling, but a messier reality of partial disengagement and selective diversification. Trump's recalibrated strategy reflects a recognition of this complexity. The question is no longer whether the U.S. and China should decouple entirely. It is whether they can redefine interdependence in a way that reduces vulnerability without triggering systemic shock. This is not an ideological project. It is an exercise in damage control. China, for its part, has drawn similar conclusions. Beijing understands that complete economic rupture would be destabilizing, not just for the global system, but for China's own growth model. Export markets, technology access, financial stability, these remain sensitive pressure points. As a result, China's response to U.S. pressure has been dual track: accelerate self-reliance while quietly preserving critical economic links where possible. In this context, Trump's pivot opens limited but meaningful space for economic engagement. Trade stabilization, supply chain transparency, and managed competition become feasible once the assumption of total separation is abandoned. Cooperation is no longer framed as trust-based partnership, but as mutual risk management. This reframing matters. When rivalry is treated as absolute, every transaction becomes suspect and every concession a betrayal. When rivalry is managed, economic interaction becomes conditional but functional. The goal shifts from integration to predictability, from dependence to resilience, yet this balance is fragile. Domestic politics on both sides reward toughness, not nuance. In the United States, China remains a convenient symbol of lost manufacturing and strategic anxiety. In China, resistance to American pressure reinforces narratives of national revival and sovereignty. Economic cooperation, therefore, must survive not only structural tensions, but political incentives that favor confrontation. The deeper challenge is that economic interdependence itself has become a security issue. Semiconductors, energy technologies, critical minerals, these are no longer neutral commodities. They are instruments of power. Trump's strategy recognizes this reality, seeking not to end interdependence, but to weapon-proof it. The central question, then, is not whether the U.S. and China still need each other economically. They do. The question is whether they can accept that need without perceiving it as weakness. If economic ties are reimagined as stabilizers rather than vulnerabilities, rivalry may remain intense but manageable. If not, the world risks drifting toward a bifurcated system that is poorer, more volatile, and far less capable of absorbing shocks. Trump's pivot suggests an awareness of this risk. Whether it can be navigated without tipping back into escalation remains one of the defining uncertainties of the coming decade. No issue tests the limits of U.S.-China strategic management more severely than Taiwan. It is the fulcrum upon which military deterrence, economic interdependence, and political symbolism converge. Trump's recalibrated approach toward China inevitably raises a critical question. Does a more pragmatic transactional strategy lower the risk of conflict over Taiwan, or does it merely repackage the danger? For decades, stability across the Taiwan Strait has rested on a delicate equilibrium. The United States upheld strategic ambiguity, deterring Beijing from force while discouraging Taipei from unilateral declarations of independence. China, for its part, tolerated ambiguity so long as it did not harden into permanent separation. Peace endured not because of trust, but because no side believed time was running out. Trump's evolving posture suggests a return, albeit imperfect, to this logic. By pairing firm deterrence with reduced rhetorical escalation, his strategy appears designed to signal resolve without provocation. Military strength remains visible, alliances intact, but language shifts from moral absolutism to strategic calculation. This matters. In crises, Words often accelerate events faster than weapons. Economic engagement plays a subtle role here. By reopening channels of negotiation with Beijing, Trump's pivot implicitly lowers the perception that the U.S. seeks to permanently contain or humiliate China. This, in turn, may reduce the pressure on Chinese leaders to act decisively before their strategic window closes. In geopolitics, perceived deadlines are among the most dangerous forces, yet the risks remain profound. Taiwan is not merely a strategic asset, it is a question of legitimacy for the Chinese state and a test of credibility for American power. Any U.S. strategy that appears transactional, suggesting flexibility or bargaining, may unsettle Taipei. Taiwan's leaders must ask whether deterrence is being strengthened or subtly diluted. This uncertainty could provoke unintended consequences. If Taiwan doubts the durability of U.S. support, it may accelerate its own defensive measures or political signaling in ways that Beijing interprets as provocation. Conversely, if China misreads strategic pragmatism as weakening resolve, it may test boundaries more aggressively. In both cases, misinterpretation becomes the catalyst for escalation. Trump's challenge, therefore, is calibration. Strategic pragmatism can reduce risk only if deterrence remains unmistakable and communication channels remain open. Ambiguity must be managed, not abandoned. The goal is to convince all parties that restraint serves their interests better than speed. History offers a sobering lesson. Wars over contested territories often begin not when one side seeks conquest, but when multiple sides fear losing leverage. Taiwan's safety depends on ensuring that no actor, Beijing, Washington, or Taipei, believes delay is fatal. Trump's pivot gestures toward this understanding. It recognizes that maximalist postures narrow options and compress time. Whether this recognition translates into sustainable policy is uncertain. Taiwan remains the most volatile fault line in global politics, where even prudent strategies operate under extreme pressure. In the end, strategic pragmatism can buy time, but time alone does not guarantee peace. It must be used to stabilize expectations, reinforce deterrence, and resist the illusion that decisive action today is safer than patience tomorrow. Trump's strategic pivot toward China ultimately reflects a broader transformation underway in the international system. The era of uncontested dominance has faded. What replaces it is not harmony, but managed rivalry, a condition in which cooperation and competition coexist uneasily, each constraining the other. The challenge for U.S.-China relations is not to eliminate rivalry, but to prevent it from becoming the organizing principle of every interaction. In a multipolar world, absolute victories are rare and systemic failures are common. Economic decoupling on a grand scale would fracture global growth, disrupt innovation, and amplify regional instability. Military escalation, particularly between nuclear-armed states, would impose costs beyond calculation. Trump's recalibration suggests an implicit recognition of these limits. It accepts that power must be exercised within constraints, and that leverage is most effective when it preserves options rather than forecloses them. This approach carries a sober logic. Cooperation does not require trust. It requires mutual interest. On climate resilience, financial stability, pandemic preparedness, and supply chain security, the interests of Washington and Beijing intersect even as their strategic ambitions diverge. Selective engagement in these areas is not a concession, it is risk management. In complex systems, insulation against shocks matters as much as competitive advantage. Yet fragility defines this balance. Domestic politics on both sides incentivize confrontation. Allies demand clarity and reassurance. Markets react swiftly to ambiguity. In such conditions, even pragmatic strategies can be overwhelmed by narratives of zero-sum conflict. The danger is not a single bad decision, but the accumulation of small choices that normalize hostility and compress diplomatic space. Trump's pivot also underscores a deeper truth. Security and economics can no longer be separated. Technological ecosystems, energy transitions, and critical materials sit at the intersection of national power and global welfare. Managing these domains requires rules, communication, and restraint, none of which emerge automatically from rivalry. They must be built deliberately. The Taiwan question exemplifies the stakes. It is the litmus test of whether managed rivalry can hold. If strategic pragmatism preserves ambiguity, reinforces deterrence, and reduces perceived deadlines, it can lower the risk of catastrophic miscalculation. If it breeds uncertainty or transactional misreading, it can do the opposite. Outcomes hinge less on declarations than on consistency and credibility over time. The path forward, therefore, is narrow but navigable. It demands firmness without fixation, engagement without illusion, and competition without demonization. It requires leaders to resist the political rewards of escalation and to invest instead in the quieter work of stabilization, communication channels, confidence measures, and bounded agreements that survive electoral cycles. History will judge this moment not by whether rivalry persisted, it will, but by whether it was governed. Trump's strategic pivot gestures toward governance over grievance, leverage over confrontation, and patience over panic. Whether these gestures become policy and whether policy becomes practice will shape not only U.S.-China relations, but the resilience of the global order itself. In a multipolar age, the most consequential victories are often invisible. Crises that do not occur, wars that do not begin, and rivalries that remain contained. The task ahead is to make those invisible victories sustainable.